Welcome back. You tune into Mid Morning Talk with Mariam Mia. And now we're moving on to something I came across on Business Tech. It says taxpayers will face increasing scrutiny from South African Revenue Services as is effectively lowered the threshold to criminally prosecute taxpayers. Prior to the latest tax amendment legislation becoming final, a taxpayer willfully and without just cause. Uh, The proposed amendments could effectively remove SARS' obligation to prove intention before a taxpayer could be found guilty of these non-compliance. So I've got joining me an accomplished tax expert, Piet Nel. He's a project director of the professional development at South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Mr. Piet Nel was involved in tax consultants and tax disputes prior to him joining South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. He's an accounting member of the tax court. He's also a visiting professor at WITS, and he was previously a lecturer in tax at the University of Pretoria, as well as a lecturer at UNISA at the postgraduate level program. He's a member of SAICA's National Tax Committee, and he's still quite active in the development of tax legislation in South Africa by commenting on proposed legislation. And that is why we think he's more than qualified in terms of commenting regarding this new legislation that has come into play and what are the implications for me and you as taxpayers. So let's welcome Mr. Peter Nel to Mid Morning Talk on Salam Media. Good morning, Mr. Nel.
Good morning, and I feel welcome, and thank you for the introduction.
Thank you for joining us. And so I've read this article about we as taxpayers can now no longer use I've made a mistake or it was an error on my part in terms of when we're filling in our form, and an error could lead us to prosecution or facing a fine. So can you explain to us what is the first of all, what are these new amendments to the law and what is the implication for an ordinary taxpayer like myself?
Yes. So I want to start with your reference to error, because error, we have two categories of penalties, and I think it's important to see this amendment also in that context. So if I submit a return and I make a bona fide error, there's a potential of an understatement penalty. So I've declared less taxable income than I should have, and SARS can penalize me. What we have here is non-compliance penalty. So it's where you've not done something that you would have, that you should have done in terms of the legislation. So this is a penalty for non-complying with the legislation itself. Now, maybe I can just take a little step back. When SARS announced the draft legislation last year, we all had an opportunity to comment on that. And SAICA's view was, as with many other people, there were really fierce resistance against this change that SARS intended. Our view was that we understand that SARS have a problem collecting returns, getting returns submitted on time. So people are really not submitting the returns that they should have done. And this does not only extend to taxpayers like yourself and myself, but also to employers, IRP5s. You've heard a lot of people saying that they can't file their tax return because the employer didn't file the return. So what SARS have done is to remove from the legislation that penalized and treated that as an offense. And I just want to read from the legislation that willful and without just cause. So the old rules, and the rule shines on the 20th of January this year, the old rule was that SARS had to prove that you really intentionally and without any cause didn't comply with your obligations in terms of the legislation. Now, as that article explains it quite nicely, what they've done is to make a change there and to separate the offences, the non-compliance, the ones that can be penalised by way of an offence, and it's a 2-year penalty or a fine, 2 year in jail. All right. So they've took the less serious ones and they categorize that in the one category, and the other one is the more serious ones. And principally, if I read from that, so the less serious one carries, they both carry the same penalty. But the less serious one is where you don't put in return. So you are negligent. This is why they brought that word negligence in there. So SARS is expecting of taxpayers to exercise reasonable care. Where you don't exercise a reasonable care by not submitting your returns, then and doing some of the other, there's many offences listed. As the article says, about 11 of them in this category. Then SARS will penalise you. The second category is what they see the more serious ones, and they relate to the evasion of tax, essentially. So the bulk of that you will see deals with the evasion of tax, obtaining undue tax refunds, and there's fraud and error, and not error, fraud and theft involved. So the first one is an error. You didn't put in your return, but you were negligent. You didn't take reasonable care in doing so. The second one, having more that fraud and theft element of that. So really, that's why they brought that in. The negligence now is you're potentially criminally liable, and the burden of proof is now on you to prove that you were not guilty of tax evasion or fraud, etc. Whereas in the first instance, the less serious one, SARS nearly need to prove that you didn't put in the return and that you were absolutely negligent in not doing so.
So, to be on the right side or the correct side of the law, um, what are some counsel and advice that you can offer to our listeners here? Look, you know what, the tax evasion and fraud and that, those are premeditated, you do, but I'm talking about ordinary citizens. Sometimes, you know what, filling in that form becomes overwhelming because you might be a new taxpayer, just getting into your career. You've been handed an IRIP 5 form. You go onto the website. You're doing your filing submission, and yes, maybe not negligence, but because you don't know the ropes, you might fill in something incorrectly. What is your advice and counsel, especially for somebody who's what I would call a tax novice in terms of
Yes.
doing filing?
I think the bulk of the people that it's aimed at are those tax novices in a sense. And then I agree with you that the evasion and the theft, etc., they may be not isolated cases in South Africa, but yeah, that shouldn't worry most of your listeners, I would think. So I think let me start with an example and then explain what is involved here. So if you have a novice, let's say you start with a new business, you start earning income as a salary earner, and you have an employer that pay you a salary and withhold employees tax. Now, what the Tax Administration Act requires of you is to actually register and then submit your returns. So those are two of this, and this is the less serious offences. So where you don't register as a taxpayer or don't submit a return, they now became a criminal obligation. So what this change is saying is that a person that starts earning income should really know that they have to submit the tax return, have to register with SARS. And the advice to people would be that when you start, you can't really just on your own think, oh, I don't have to register. Maybe my income is too little or whatever it is. You have to do reasonable care, sort of requires of you to ask somebody. If you don't ask and don't try and maybe phone SARS, although I find that a bit of a cumbersome process, but ask somebody, but professionally, particularly a professional person that can advise you when you are required to register. And then, in addition to that, once you're now registered, you have an obligation to submit returns. Now, certain people that earn a salary below certain thresholds and have what we call the standard case, just pension and medical, they don't have to submit a return if their income is from one employer only for the full year and below 500,000. But you need to confirm that. This is what is required of persons. So you need to determine or establish what your obligations are from a submitting a return, registration with SARS, etc. So you need to find that out. Maybe to also look at the employer. The employer has an obligation when they pay employees tax when they pay remuneration to an employee, then they must withhold employees' tax. So when we look at the offences here, the less serious ones is where they don't put in the return to declare what they've withheld. But the more serious one is where they withheld tax and didn't pay that over to SARS. This is, as you can see, this is more a criminal intent there. And here SARS will say, yeah, that is a more serious offence, which we don't have to prove intent. If we just can show that you didn't pay that money over and you used it, you kept it in your business to pay for other business expenses, then we will then they will penalise under the more severe one. But again, your protection against this is to make sure that you understand what, as an employer, taxpayer, your obligations are with regard to submitting returns, paying money to SARS.
And now I need to ask you, as an employee, I'm especially, when I look at the newly graduated
Yes.
young professionals, your educators, for example, I mean, employed by government, nurses, or even somebody who's now in corporate. You get your first paycheck, you see PAYE has been deducted. Is it our, as an employee, our burden of responsibility to ensure that I contact SARS to get a tax number, and then after a year to go to the HR department and ensure that I have an IRP5 form, or do I wait for my employee to say you've worked for a year, here's your RIP5 form, and then how do I know whether to make that, establish or make the determination whether I'm above that threshold that I need to submit an online return, or the fact that my PAYE was deducted and paid over to SARS, I don't need to submit. So when do you make that determination that every year when it's tax season, I need to file in my tax submission?
Very, very good question. And I think this is where the bulk of the problems lie that SARS wanted to address, and the bulk of the problems that we as tax practitioners and SAICM members experience in trying to submit returns and dealing with people that haven't done what they should have done. So the first thing is that the obligation is on a person the moment you start earning income to register as a taxpayer. Now, SARS has made that system, as far as an employer-employee is concerned, a lot easier, and it's possible for the employer to register the individual as a taxpayer. So I would, in that instance, as a new employee in any firm, governmental or whatever it is, I would ask whether they've done that, and if they haven't, then I would register myself as a taxpayer. So that's your first obligation.
Before you go on, is it difficult?
Yes.
So if my employee hasn't, or they're dragging their feet, and I'm concerned because now I don't want to be penalized in any way, is it a cumbersome process? Do I have to call SARS, or do I need somebody from maybe your institute to assist me and facilitate this? How difficult is this process of getting a tax number?
It is not difficult, and we must compliment SARS on that, particularly last year with the COVID. So exactly a year ago, SARS introduced, because people now could no longer go into the SARS offices. They had to see you. They had to take a picture of you. They've now made it really simple to register. So you go on the e-filing, and there's a guide that explains it to you. So you don't, and I think you don't have to go to professional persons to ask and assist you with that. It's much easier to register yourself. There's a couple of questions that they ask where they confirm your personal detail, like your identity number with the departments and with banks, and if you've got a bank account, etc., or belong to a medical scheme, they will confirm some of the detail. So it is actually quite a simple process. And if SARS, and it's done electronically, so you can do it from your own computer, and if SARS has further information that they require, they will then schedule a virtual meeting with you, where you then can either electronically submit proof of certain things, like a bank account particularly, or your ID book, or where they want to take a picture, then you'll have the picture, you'll scan it in, and they'll have a virtual meeting like we have now, and you will show that picture and then submit it to them, and then they're happy with that. So it's a relatively straightforward, easy process, and has been made really simple last year.
Okay, so you were telling us point one is find out if your employee registers you, or you've now given us in detail if we need to get our own tax number. What's the next step, especially for young graduates?
Yeah. So the next step then is now to submit the return. So the employer, your year of assessment runs from the 1st of March till the end of February. So let's say we talk about last year, February. The employers must now submit proof to SARS, which includes your IRP5. The IRP5 reflects what you earn from that employer during that period that you were employed there, the gross income and the taxes that they've withheld. They must now submit to all their, for all, in respect of all their employers, this reconciliation as it's called. And the reconciliation essentially says, look, we've issued IRP5s for all the employees' tax that we've withheld in respect of remuneration paid to persons. So your first step would be to obtain from your employer that IRP5. Now, there's a lot of employers that refuse and say, look, I've already given it to SARS, but they have an obligation to give it to you. And I would insist to get that. So then I know that they've done that. I don't want to go into what if they haven't done that, becomes quite a complicated mess. Then the next step is...
Sorry, you know what? I'm interrupting you at the stages because I just want clarity and I want everybody to understand this. So we always stay on the right side of the tax law. So if I have an obligation and I need to say, can I please have my RIP5 form? I want to fill in or send my submission in online. If I find there's some resistance or I've asked and 3 or 4 weeks have gone by and I have not received my RIP5 form, what recourse do I have or who do I then go to ensure that I eventually get my RIP5?
Yeah, look, I think so. The first step would be to go back to the employer and say, listen, please, I'm entitled to that. And this is I think, and I'm happy that you asked that question. So the employer is under an obligation to issue that RP5 to the employee. So it's not saying, look, I've given it to SARS and that's sufficient. So normally people then go to SARS and say, look, SARS, the employer hasn't. And then the answer is, well, they haven't submitted their reconciliation and that's why. So they're not telling you that. Or then you'll go to some professional and get them to write a formal letter and say, listen, I'm entitled to this. I'm not entitled to, you must as employer give me that. So please, can I have that? Otherwise, you've got this problem. We find that then you can't submit the return. And your neg obligation is to now submit that return. And what I wanted to leading on to there is that SARS annually tells us that the filing season opens at some point. Mm-hmm. And it's generally the 1st of July. So they will issue, which we expect to happen within the next month or so, a public notice saying everybody that is required to submit a return must do so and start from the 1st of July until the end of whatever it is, normally November for normal people and for normal taxpayers, and provisional taxpayers much later. So then your next step as a new employee is to then file your return. Now, to make it easier, SARS has said, and let's call it this little, you know that song about little boxes, we all got put in little boxes. So they've defined a certain category of taxpayers that are typically salary earners that work for one employer for the full year, that only have medical and retirement or pension fund contributions. And they said, you don't have to submit a return. We will populate that, SARS being the person doing that, will populate the information that we received from your employer, that we received from the medical, that we received from the bank, if you may have interest income, etc. And they then, what they call is make available and will send an SMS to the individual. So look, this is what we've done. We've received this from the employer and we are going to assess you on that. If you agree with that, you accept it. So this is what they call the auto-assessment principle. And then you don't have to actually go and call up a return and complete it. So it's all done from the information get from third parties. Any person outside of that, so particularly if you earn a salary of more than 500,000 Rand, then you have to put in a return, even though your employer has also dealt with all the taxes, etc. So here again, so when the filing season starts, we understand that SARS will be issuing again a notification to a person and say, look, we've received detail from your employer and other third parties. We believe you don't have to submit a return. Please confirm. So that's your first step. Confirm if you fall within that bracket. Of course, if you don't and you've got other income, maybe you've inherited money, you've received other tax-free income, then of course you will have to request a return and submit it. So the next step for these persons, other than the standard cases, the ones that fall into that little boxes, as I've said, They must request a return and then complete that return and submit it to SARS.
Okay. So I like this automated, as you've said
Mm.
now, because then if everything is there, it's on SaaS. Now, in this automated process, presumably there'll be an option where there's something you don't agree. Then is there a mechanism in which you can then populate the fields with evidence why you feel this assessment is incorrect?
Yes, yeah. We also believe that this is absolutely the right way to go for SARS, to have those auto assessments, but they must give that opportunity to the taxpayer to say, listen, I agree with that. And now what happens if you get that SMS and you say, listen, I don't, there's additional information that I must declare, then you will click no and say, I don't accept this auto assessment. It will then open up on e filing. And that would require of you to have been registered user on e filing as well, which is the next step after you've registered to just get on e filing. But I would only do that if I don't fall within that auto assessment place. That return will then open up like for a normal other taxpayer, and I can correct errors. Maybe there's an error in the information that SARS has got on that return, or I can add additional incomes or deductions that I'm entitled to. Maybe your medical is a lot more than what went through the medical fund. So you will then add that and then submit that return. So you become a normal taxpayer or tax filer in a sense.
And if you agree, and the automated response is you qualify for a refund or rebate back from SARS, well, then that happen automatically once you've said I agree with this. Well, then SARS within that 48-hour, I don't know,
Yes.
72-hour period, will you be reimbursed automatically then?
Yes, it normally would, and particularly in those auto assessments. Our experience last year was that within that, as you said, 48 hours or whatever it is, the refund happened, and you were absolutely entitled to lodge a complaint with SARS or to follow up if that didn't happen. And you'll see on that there you'll have to be able to follow it up in the most efficient way is to actually have an e-filing profile, because that will disclose the progress of the refund to you. So yeah, on the auto assessments, our experience was those payments were made in time, very, very quickly, within a couple of days after your submission of your return or that acceptance of that auto assessment, but also with other returns. And you had the opportunity, if it didn't happen, to then follow up with SARS. And they will tell you, they're there, you can do a phone call. They will tell you, no, there's in progress, we're looking at something, or there's something missing, and then you can deal with that.
Mr. Nel, whatever is telling me, I think a good sound advice would be that when it comes to paying of your taxes and submitting tax returns, best honesty is the best policy, and it is best to be open and upfront with SARS,
Mm.
because that's going to keep you on the right side of law. And I think they say there's only two certainties in life, that is taxes and death in Texas.
Yeah.
And I think tax returns and problems of SARS is an issue that keeps many, many people awake at night. And one of the major stresses is when you find yourself on the wrong side of SARS, or having SARS now wanting to audit you, or then
Yeah.
send somebody to do this. I mean, it causes insurmountable stress and pressure, and it affects your normal day-to-day functioning. So always best policy to be honest and upfront in all your dealings with SARS.
Yeah, no, there's nothing that I can add to what you've said. It's absolutely right. So, but just to give you an example of what has now changed. So the law requires of us to do a true declaration of all our income and expenses. So we must not lie on our returns, right? But then also SARS's ability to audit that. So we've now put in our returns, so we're not negligent, we're compliant. But then they want to audit my information. And if I then do not respond and give them the supporting documents that make up my declaration or support my declaration, then they will penalize me. This is a request for something that it's non-compliant. So here again, if you willfully, so intentionally don't answer them, SARS will be able to then penalize you, put you in jail for 2 years if you're finally convicted of that. But in addition to that, if you've lied on your return, you'll also get understatement penalties. You've declared your income to be lower than what it was, and those things are penalized. And it Definitely. If you look at the people that have got that penalties, it's not worth going there.
Absolutely. Yes, and I think it's about time now we have a mindset change when it comes to paying of taxes. Yes, it's a grudge payment. Nobody
Mm.
likes to pay taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes, especially in a country like South Africa. We
Yeah.
feel, I think, short change when we see the amount of corruption taking place. Our hard tax earned money supposed to go in development of our country, in education, in healthcare, and that. Yet we see the state of all the structures of government, and thus can be solely laid at the hands of corruption. We look
Mm.
at parastatals like ESCOM and things like this. So I think that is why some individuals use not paying tax as justification, but those are separate issues, and I think we need to have a mindset change.
Mm.
Um, 2019, I visited Canada, and for me, that was an eye opener in terms of mindset because everybody wants to declare uh, whether
Mm.
they have even additional income. So if somebody who is working full time does additional tuition, for instance, they very focused in terms of
Yeah.
documenting it, documenting the hours, and that goes. So everybody makes a spreadsheet throughout the year, and I was so amazed. They keep a record or they keep a spreadsheet of any additional income they might have earned over and above the normal employment. They do this, and I said, "But why are you so rigorous? Who's gonna know you just had 3 or 4 hours of additional income that you did in tuition?" And the answer was, why would I not want to declare it? And I was blown over by that comment that they looked at it in that way, but why won't I want to declare this? Because it's important for me to be open and honest. And I think maybe we need that mindset shift to say, you know what, I need to declare all my income because that's just the right thing to do.
I absolutely agree with you. So when I started out in practice as a tax practitioner, I sat with some people from the United Kingdom and South Africans. We certainly had that intention. Now, tax is the last thing we think about, whereas they upfront said that. So I can't agree with you more. And the corruption and the wasteful expenditure and things that we must manage or object to through another system. It's not by not submitting your return. So you're absolutely right. Canadians have got the right attitude, and this is what I agree with you. Need to change in South Africa. We need to know that we've got obligations to submit returns, register taxpayer, file our returns, and when there's a tax due, a tax liability to pay that tax. So I absolutely agree with you.
Mr. Nell, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope I can get you on sometime on different facets of text just to guide our our listeners, our viewers in terms of taxation, and also maybe one day I'd like to get you on because if you are now in a problem where probably you underdeclared or you underpaid, and now you get slapped with penalties and things like that, which is the best way in terms of now working with SARS to correct all your not declaring properly or underpayment, and that in terms of guiding one and providing best counsel in terms of setting your stack. Now you're determined to set your tax affairs correctly. So I'd like to get you on a program like this just to guide because some people might be on the wrong side of the law, of tax law. But yes, there's always hope and there's always an avenue for remediation. So just to give us then counsel and advice in the way you go in terms of your engagements with SARS to actually get you compliant. Because at the end of the day, that's what SARS wants, even if you're non-compliant, to get you to be
Mm.
compliant. So I'd like to get you on in the future on a program like this. I really appreciate your time and thank you for joining us here
Mm.
on Salam Media.
Okay, my pleasure, and absolutely welcome to do that.
Thank
Thanks.
you and go well.
Thank you. So,
We're going to go for a short break. And when we return, we're going to be talking about the quality of our drinking water.